There is probably a bottle of it in your refrigerator right now. You put it on fries, on burgers, on things you are slightly embarrassed to admit. It is the most consumed condiment in the United States, roughly 650 million bottles sold every single year. But here is what the label does not tell you. In 1834, a doctor prescribed it to cure liver disease. In the decades before or that, scientists believed it could stop a cholera epidemic. And less than 2 centuries before all of this, people were genuinely convinced that the main ingredient was a deadly poison. This is not the story of a condiment. This is the story of how one sauce traveled halfway across the world, got turned into medicine, almost destroyed people's health, and then conquered every table on Earth. Welcome to Object Lore, where the history of the ordinary turns out to be anything but. To understand ketchup, you have to leave Europe entirely and travel to the coastal cities of southern China and what is now Vietnam. Around the late 17th century, fishermen in those regions prepared a condiment called ketchup, a word from the Hokkien dialect, roughly translated as brine of fermented fish. It was not red. It was not sweet. It bore absolutely no resemblance to what you have in your kitchen right now. Ketchup was a dark, intensely pungent liquid, made from salted fish entrails left to ferment in the sun until the proteins had fully broken down. The smell, by most historical accounts, was remarkable in all the wrong ways, but it worked. Sailors along the South China Sea used it to preserve and flavor food on journeys that could last months at a time. By the early 1700s, British merchants and sailors trading along Asian routes had encountered ketchup and brought it back to England, but the original recipe proved difficult to replicate. Without access to specific fish or fermentation techniques, British cooks began substituting what they had: mushrooms, walnuts, oysters, anchovies. Each cook produced a different version. Each version was still called ketchup. For nearly a century, ketchup was not a single product. It was a category, a broad term for any sharp, fermented, savory sauce. And the tomato? The tomato had not even been invited into the conversation, because in Europe during all of this, the tomato had a very different reputation. The fruit had arrived from South America in the 16th century, carried back by Spanish explorers. European botanists recognized it almost immediately as a member of the nightshade family, a group of plants known to include several genuinely toxic species. They gave it the Latin name Solanum lycopersicum and called it, informally, the poison apple. For most of Europe, the tomato was a garden ornament, beautiful to look at, not to be eaten. And when wealthy Europeans did eat it, they paid a price. Aristocrats who served tomatoes at their tables began developing disturbing symptoms: fatigue, confusion, and in some documented cases, death. The tomato was tried, convicted, and sentenced in the court of public opinion. What no one realized, and what took historians and scientists generations to unravel, was that the real killer was not the tomato at all. It was the plate. Wealthy Europeans ate from pewter, a metal alloy with a significant lead content. The high acidity of tomatoes reacted with that lead, slowly dissolving trace amounts into every bite. The symptoms were those of lead poisoning. The tomato received the blame. Think of it like a crime scene where the actual weapon leaves no trace. And an entirely innocent bystander carries the sentence for 200 years. For nearly 2 centuries, an entire civilization avoided one of the most nutritious foods on Earth because of a dinner plate. But here is where the story turns entirely. In the early 1800s, a growing number of American scientists began looking at the tomato with different eyes. Among them was a physician and professor named John Cook Bennett. He had been studying tomatoes not with suspicion, but with genuine scientific curiosity. And in 1834, he published his conclusions. Tomatoes, he argued, were not just edible, they were medically powerful. His list of conditions they could treat read like a pharmacist's inventory: chronic liver disease, dyspepsia, violent bilious attacks, diarrhea, and general digestive weakness. The tomato, in Bennett's view, was a cure waiting to be accepted. His solution was practical. If people refused to eat tomatoes raw, he would process them into pills. By 1835, patent medicine manufacturers across Ohio and Indiana were advertising compound tomato pills in regional newspapers. Some contained concentrated tomato extract. Others, according to those who purchased and examined them, contained very little tomato at all. The patent medicine industry of the 19th century operated on a remarkably consistent principle. The claim was the product, the label was the proof. The tomato had traveled from condemned poison to celebrated panacea in under 2 decades. Neither reputation, it would turn out, was entirely deserved. By the 1880s, ketchup had become an industrial product, manufactured in quantities that would have been unimaginable a generation earlier. And to meet that scale, manufacturers had made some significant compromises. The ketchup of the late 19th century was frequently produced from overripe or decomposing tomatoes, fruit that could not be sold at market. To conceal the evidence of decay, manufacturers added coal tar dyes for color. To extend shelf life, they added large quantities, almost of sodium benzoate, a chemical preservative whose long-term effects on human health remained poorly understood. What was in the bottle looked like ketchup. Whether it qualified as food was a separate question. In 1902, a chemist named Harvey Washington Wiley, chief of the Bureau of Chemistry at the United States Department of Agriculture, decided to answer that question directly. He recruited 12 young government volunteers and began serving them regular meals containing precisely measured doses of chemical preservatives, sodium benzoate, formaldehyde, copper sulfate, and borax. The volunteers kept detailed daily health journals. Several reported persistent headaches, nausea, and disrupted cognition. The press, which followed the experiment with considerable interest, gave the group a name: the Poison Squad. Wiley's findings contributed directly to the passage of the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906, the first federal law in American history regulating what manufacturers could legally place inside a food product. But one company had already found a cleaner solution, 30 years before the law required it. In 1876, Henry J. Heinz introduced a ketchup made from ripe tomatoes, distilled vinegar, and sugar. The vinegar preserved it naturally. The sugar softened the acidity. The result was stable, consistent, and required no artificial additives. Heinz did not invent ketchup. He defined it, and in doing so, quietly closed a chapter that had begun in a fish market on the South China Sea. So the next time you reach for that bottle, the red one, the one shaped exactly as you remember, consider what it took to get there: a fermented fish sauce from the South China Sea. A fruit condemned for 2 centuries for a crime committed by a dinner plate. A 19th century physician who believed in tomato pills. 12 government employees who volunteered to eat chemical preservatives alongside their lunch. And one Pittsburgh businessman who decided that ripe tomatoes and vinegar were simply enough. 650 million bottles a year. Every single one the product of a history that no label has ever bothered to print. And ketchup is not the only condiment with a story like this. There is a salt that financed entire armies, a spice that was once weighed in against silver, and one liquid that spent 3 centuries being used as a weapon before anyone thought to put it on food. If you want to know which one is next, subscribe to Object Lore. And if this made you look at your condiment shelf differently, share it with someone who deserves to know. They will either find it fascinating or they will never eat ketchup again. Either way, you will have made an impression.